Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining another live data chat with Kevin and David. And today we're joined by a very special guest, a very good friend doing heroic data work as the head of data at Car and Classic, which is Europe's leading marketplace for buying really dope cars. So everyone out there, definitely Google Car and Classic because I spent like 15 minutes looking at the site yesterday, being like, okay, this is where people get those cars that when they drive by, you're like, what am I even doing right now? What is this? So, James, thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me and for a very nice introduction. Heroic was very strong, strong phrasing, but I appreciate it.
If there's like 100 people using data and one person, who's the head of data, that sounds like a daunting task for anyone. So congrats on that.
Oh, thank you very much. We do have another analyst has recently joined us in the last 3 months since we spoke, so it's become less heroic, but still somewhat.
Okay, we're gonna have to ask questions about in a sec, but maybe to kick us off, how did you get into the world of data?
Yes, I think I probably had a similar trajectory to a lot of people in data that I speak to of my kind of age, which was I did a quantitative degree at university in mathematics, and then really at the time from that learned that I liked working with data. I like working with numbers. I like data, and I was not bad at programming. So the kind of data kind of finds you at that point, I think. So that's what initially kind of like sparked my interest in it, and then from there I kind of early career hopped around a few different data analyst roles at like large retail organizations in the UK, and just got more and more into it and really loved it. So that was kind of like how I got into it. So
Gotcha.
And how did you get into like data engineering? Because you've got a bit more into that, haven't you? From having had that analyst background, it's kind of similar to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, so yes, yeah. My early roles were all very analyst, but all very analyst, and then kind of my first role where I really started to get more into the kind of foundations of data engineering were in consultancy, and it was a small it was a healthcare consultancy which had a kind of data function to it. And it was incredibly old school, and I kind of picked up some data engineering practices just from needing to use them for that kind of function to work at all. So it's kind of just by necessity. They were running these huge data projects basically out of Excel spreadsheets, and I kind of came to the conclusion this doesn't work. We need an actual, at the time it was just kind of like a SQL database and some actual scripts to transform all of this. And that kind of got me started with like the fundamentals of proper SQL, Python, ETL, etc., and then kind of just going through my next few roles, which were more like kind of head of data, but from an analytics perspective, I just kind of slowly gravitated more and more towards that side of things, and then had a role where I was first exposed to kind of what I'd call like the modern data stack. So someone running like an ELT pipeline with a proper data warehouse and DBT project, and that was kind of saw the light on that and how kind of impactful that was, and just wanted to do a lot more with it.
So were those already there, or did you bring them in? Did you bring in DBT?
So in my so this was in my role before my current role, and that was the director of engineering. I was working more as like a data scientist at the time, actually, which is kind of weird. I've had so many data roles, and it was brought in by I forget what his role was, but he was kind of like head of engineering / data, and he brought in DBT into that role. I kind of learned all of that there and worked with him on a lot of it, and then going into my current role was the first opportunity to implement all of that from scratch with what I'd learned effectively. So I had kind of a relatively clean slate in the current role.
Great. And how that kind of brings us nicely to like, how did you end up at Current Classic?
So yeah, it's a really good question. Really good question. I actually, sorry, I'm going through so much like job history here, but I worked at a company called Kazana a few years ago, and they were an automotive data platform, so software as a service, and they would sell automotive data into insurers, big car retailers in the UK, and it was all kind of data science led pricing, vehicle pricing suggestions, etc., etc. But basically, the long story short is that the founder of that company is the current CEO at Car and Classic. I knew the COO as well, and they kind of had a need in this space. The relationship was already there, and the kind of timing was right, and I've kind of trusted them both a lot. So it was just having that kind of relationship there, and then it being right place, right time, and the right role and the right subject matter, because I love data and I really like cars as well. So it's nice when those things overlap, which happens rarely, but when it does, it's lovely.
That sounds amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, just right time at the right place, I guess, to end up where I am now. It's been a lot of like nice bits of timing and coincidences, I'd say.
So the need was there. Like, how did they arrive at the need for a head of data? Or did you pitch them on
it? Yeah, I mean, it was actually like, yeah, I think it wasn't the original kind of need wasn't identified as a head of data. It was probably like a head of BI, I think, was potentially what was being thrown around at the time, and kind of had a few discussions. And I said, you know, your issues aren't really at the BI layer. It's everything behind that. And I think just hiring a head of BI with nothing to kind of empower them to do the job would be a recipe for someone to probably be quite disappointed and leave quite early on. So yeah, there was a lot of conversation about that, and I kind of identified like, look, this is what I think actually you need, and they're very smart guys, so took me at my word for it, and here we are.
Great, and I think that kind of goes nicely into our next question. Like, what were your early concerns on your mind as the first data leader? Like, what were your things that you were concerned about or wanting to look into?
Yeah, like a lot of it for me was around, so there was some data infrastructure in place, which was, you know, for a team which didn't really have much or any dedicated data resource, wasn't terrible. There was like a, you know, Metabase instance set up and a few kind of basic but like functional reports. But yeah, I guess there was a need to be better than what was there already. So making sure I could kind of get in and like demonstrate some value quite quickly for me was like a big part of, because I really had to bring the whole company on the journey I've been on, I think, for it to be valid and trusted, if that makes sense. So I think like being able to actually get in quickly, get at least a, you know, proof of concept of my idea, span up and start demonstrating some value beyond what was already there. That was definitely a big part of it. And then yeah, like it's always a concern when you're coming into like, you know, a relatively mature business that like the sprawl of and the amount of systems that were there, and like getting a handle on that, you know, especially with like more with startups, especially, there's a tendency to have a system for every single thing, and all of those systems hold wonderful, incredibly useful data, but it all tends to be quite siloed, because I think most startups lean towards cloud hosted third party stuff and not really building a lot of things in house. So yeah, like the sprawl of data and getting that all connected was a big concern of mine, and ensuring we didn't just have things sat in silos. And then yeah, like I think, which, you know, nicely leans into Metaplane as well, was quality of data and making sure it was trusted, and the need to, I think, you know, when you're coming in as that kind of data leader into a small team, you need to deliver at pace, but equally if you're delivering incorrect things at pace, it soon erodes trust. And actually, you know, you don't think of data quality. I don't think people necessarily always think of data quality as like a big value add, but I think it really is, because it underpins every single report, dashboard, data product you send out is underpinned by how much people trust that data. So if, you know, there's regularly bugs which you aren't spotting and people are regularly telling you that data's wrong, I think it just makes your job 1,000 times harder. So kind of getting a handle on that was a big thing for me.
To be honest, it's quite common for me to hear that teams want to focus first on like building everything out, and they don't focus on quality very early. Like, how did you come to, like, what was your thought process in deciding that actually no, data quality is something I need to focus on early and not like after a build?
I think probably just from prior experience. For the most part, like, I think I'd had quite a few points in my career where you've kind of built an absolute mountain on very poor foundations, and it kind of undermines the whole thing. And I think that happens a lot in data. Like, let's be honest, it's not always the most exciting thing out of a data project, the kind of data quality and that side of things. I think we have a tendency as data professionals to like, oh, I want to build a really nice data app in Streamlit with a machine learning model that predicts X, X, and X, and you get so carried away with all of those incredibly cool, incredibly fun to develop things. But yeah, from like a business perspective, I've had quite a few points in my earlier career where I'd done all of that, but you either had fundamental issues with the data underpinning it, or you had a poor understanding of the data underpinning it, or a poor understanding of the business context around the data underpinning it, and that just the whole thing kind of crumbles down. So yeah, I'd kind of battle scarred, I guess, would be the answer in short.
I'd call it wisdom.
I think they go hand in hand.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of nicely goes into like, what were your like early actions then, and like how did you compile that list of actions? How did you prioritize it? What would you have called like broken upon joining and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a big early action for me, and probably one of like the key ones, I think, was just understanding the landscape of the business in terms of what are going to be the big value adds in terms of data sets, where do they all live, what are the common issues with them, and actually speaking to people about like what's wrong at the moment and understanding what kind of common data issues are, because I think then you get like a good understanding of what you need to test for and what you need to give special attention to. So I think, yeah, like a big part of it for me is just not doing anything for a little bit and just taking the time to really get a good understanding of like business context, data sets, what's going to be the biggest value add to get imported into your new fancy solution. And then obviously like after that, actually deciding on what the tech stack should look like to support all of that. So like, you know, and just thinking, I think there's a lot of things to balance there. So just having some sort of an idea of, you know, how often does all of this need to be refreshed? Does any of this data need to be live, or is batch ELT fine for all of this? What's going to be the best solution to get all of this data centralized? And it's tough because you're balancing, there's no one right solution, and you're balancing like 50 different variables in all of that. So yeah, but like at a high level, it was understand everything, understand the current pain points, work out what solution you think is going to fix that, and then I guess just get to implementing at that point. But yeah, I think the testing and quality side should definitely be a big part of once you do get stuck into building. Don't let yourself get carried away and skip that step.
No, that first fact-finding stage where you mentioned you got to know your stakeholders and their needs, it's so intriguing and so insightful. Like, how did you do that? Did you have a process?
Probably not as much as I should have done, to be fair. It was quite an informal process of just working my way around the different areas of the business, speaking to people, asking me to show me what you've got in the kind of data space, understanding like, so what do you struggle with and what would you like to see more information about? So I think I had like at the time, a huge Notion document with every single metric that exists and then every single metric people would like to see. And then it's kind of like a balance or look at all of those as a whole. Which of those are actually going to drive the business forward in your view? Which are like the hardest to create? And then it's kind of like out of that list, find the ones which have a lot of business value and aren't impossible to create, have those as your quick wins. And then kind of, I took the approach of finding those quick win kind of metrics, KPIs, and then building the initial kind of V1 data stack around arriving at those in a trusted kind of nice way.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
So you have all the stakeholders, the metrics, and the 70 variables that you mentioned. And so who did you work with to determine the priority list there?
So a lot of that I think sometimes you kind of, it's difficult speaking to people because everyone's a little part of the organization is the most important part of the organization to them. So I almost think you've kind of got to take what they have to say on board and then almost take that away and come up with that list on your own in terms of the prioritization, taking into account what they've said. And then kind of at that stage, once you have kind of hero metrics, here's what I'm going to decide to track. I mean, if you've got sufficient buy-in from your managers, senior stakeholders, either just go away and do that without asking for permission and then go from there, which was actually kind of the approach I took actually. Or I think the other approach to that, if you don't necessarily have that level of buy-in, would be then to get all of those people back into a room, explain what you're doing and why, and then it kind of at least brings everyone together and you can kind of see the wider picture on it a bit. Because I think otherwise, yeah, like everyone kind of thinks their bit of the world is the only bit of the world that exists sometimes, and it's everyone's only trying to do the best. But yeah, I think you've got to trust yourself to be the person who has the overview of everything, which is kind of where I think, yeah, I'd like to try and sit as a data person.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, that's a privilege of being in our space is that we can and maybe should touch all functions. And you spoke a little bit about culture, maybe not using that word of, trusting data. How much work did you do on the side of like building a strong data culture?
Yeah, I think data culture is one of those things like, I think if you're doing a lot of things right as a data person, it kind of builds organically to a degree, but then there are perhaps things you have to do to like augment that. So I think tackling data problems like really head on is like a key part of that for me. So I'm sure we're all familiar as like data people with hearing like, oh, the data's always wrong on that. And people, people sometimes have opinions that like, oh no, I don't trust that metric because of X, Y, and Z. And you kind of hear that. I think it's really important to, when you hear that, kind of get to the source of it, understand why people are saying that and whether or not that's valid. And actually, like, it creates a bit of work for yourself. But I think like actually tackling those sorts of things head on is really important, because sometimes, a dashboard stopped working 2 years ago. Someone was annoyed at the time and now has kind of declared that that metric is wrong in perpetuity and they're never going to look at it again. I think that kind of happens sometimes. So being willing to like charge into that headlong and like actually win some hearts and minds on that is important. And yeah, aside from that, I think like self-service analytics is something I don't think like as an organization we've necessarily cracked yet. Where I am at the moment, I think like we're on that journey definitely, but I think that's a very rare thing that in almost my whole career I haven't seen done well in a very kind of robust way. And I think a lot of people kind of talk about self-service analytics being like a bedrock for data culture, and yeah, I think I'm not sure as many people are as far ahead as they think in that space potentially. So yeah, still on that journey, but I think Yeah, I think just as a data team, just being approachable as well. I've always kind of lent away as far as I could from kind of like the typical, or like sometimes typical kind of approach of, you know, submit a form, we'll review it, get back to you within this SLA. I like to, and there's a point at which I'm sure as our company grows, this won't become as feasible, but actually just having a culture where people can just reach out to you on Slack. If it's a bigger piece of work, it will get logged and prioritized. But for small things, let's just hop on a call and I'll try and work out what I can do for you here and now. We can talk through the problem and I can kind of point you towards these other things. And just having that culture where it's not necessarily super ticket driven, it's more like informal and people actually want to kind of reach out and kind of collaborate on stuff in the truest sense of the word.
And it makes so much sense. Like in my experience, sometimes like what people ask in a ticket is not what they really want. Or rather that like through a conversation, you can help people understand like what's the why behind the why, right? And you can get feedback from them as well. It sounds like that you have like these ongoing conversations. That
people have a very like poor idea of what's possible sometimes, and it's completely understandable because like you know, as a data team, sometimes we can do absolutely amazing things that people think aren't that possible, but then simple things which people think should be possible, we're like, oh no, sorry, that's going to take us kind of 2 weeks and a load of money. So like people kind of filter their requests through those kind of preconceptions. So as you say, like getting back to like what are you actually trying to solve here, like is invaluable, I think.
it's one of those interesting like asymmetries between the data team and the business where like you said, some things seem very easy but they're very hard and vice versa. And data quality seems like one of those things. I mean, because like you're saying, right, this dashboard wasn't working for 2 years, this number is incorrect in perpetuity. So I'm wondering, like, you know, how did you approach data quality both with tools and processes, but also in terms of how you communicated with your team about it?
Yeah, so I think like in terms of tools and processes, I think it's you could probably break this down into errors which are easy to kind of anticipate happening and errors which you don't really know the shape of until they happen. And I think having a different strategy for each of those is quite valuable. You know, things which you know could go wrong or have been past incidents of going wrong tend to lend themselves towards a kind of throw something into the test suite on DBT, have that checked at every run, and you can kind of code and understand what's happened there. And, you know, like structural issues as well, they're kind of knowable in advance. But then having a strategy for the stuff which isn't as knowable is also super valuable. So like, you know, rows dropping off a table, changes in trend, a lot of rows added to a table. You know, sometimes you might add tests that a table size should never decrease, but actually what about the inverse, and what if it's growing faster than you'd expected, and what if a distribution changes? And like, that's where metaplane came in for me, just being able to kind of blanket everything in some level of testing and then have that tell me about the weird things, and then be able to and this kind of links in nicely, I guess, because it's then what you do when you get those DBT test failures or metaplane alerts. And yeah, I think for me, it's just like being very open with the teams that impact, having like a super clear dialogue on what's happened, what the timescales are to fix it, why it's like, you know, if it's affected anything important, then, you know, having like a bit of a debrief with people so they understand, here's what's happened, here's why, here's the actions we've taken to prevent it again. I think that sort of thing is crucial for data trust. And I think sometimes people, you know, you've got to be careful, especially if you're operating within a bigger team, of how you communicate that you want people to do that kind of post-mortem exercise, because sometimes it's seen as a bit of a negative, but really it's just a learning thing and just making sure you're improving as a team. So I think, you know, having a culture within the data team and wider business where there's not really blame for that sort of thing. It's just, okay, it's happened. How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? Do we have like sufficient processes in place? and just having that kind of mindset, I think, is super super important, like culturally, I guess, and process wise. Yeah, apart from that, like, you know, we make sure we're kind of implementing sufficient tests when we are on pull requests, and that's something we're always checking for if we're building new data assets. And yeah, like, you know, leveraging software engineering best practices, having continuous integration deployment checks on your dbt repo and any other kind of data repos, I think is something which seems to have appeared in the last few years, which is just super valuable. And yeah, I remember a time of kind of like nested views with no version control, and it just feels like the kind of current landscape is so far ahead of that. Is great. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else on that list. I'd say definitely like utilizing, not reinventing the wheel is a huge part of this as well. There's good frameworks for all of this, and especially like as a small data team, if that is your position, don't try and reinvent the wheel on a lot of this. Let kind of known solutions do the work for you.
There's already enough wheels for you to build. And I like
Yeah.
how you're like, data issues are inevitable, right? And
Yeah.
you know, there's some that's under our control, but I really like what you said about the follow-up. Like how we, the conversation that happens after an incident, that is 100% under our control, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it seems like,
yeah, I think it's just a good thing to do. Like in general, I think like understanding if things have gone wrong, like why, is something we should absolutely just be doing as data professionals. Yeah.
Okay, I'm definitely going to take that with me.
Yeah.
And the last question, you mentioned you hired a great analyst 3 months ago, and would love to know, you were a data team of one. Maybe we should change the webinar title, but when and how did you grow your data team, and how do you think about growth in the future?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure it's necessarily like a one size fits all for this, but for me, it was very much like I had kind of like a clear idea of when I came in, roughly what I wanted to build as a kind of first iteration of a data stack, and knew what was involved to get to that point. And then, so kind of spent all my time kind of getting to that point, and towards the end of that was, you know, the realization hit that, you know, once we've got to the point where this thing is built, like there's more nice data than I have hours in the day to look at that nice data. So I think there was kind of like a tipping point for me of, okay, yeah, like this is the point where we need to get someone in. And yeah, hired like a really great, and it's kind of like small company things as well. I think it's easy to know when to hire. I think it's quite hard to know who to hire. I think with like the kind of job landscape in analytics at the moment, it's difficult. It's really difficult because there's so much specialization within roles, perhaps more so than there was when I first got into the industry. But you know, the downside for that for smaller teams is it's very hard to, you know, you kind of need to be clear with what the role is, and actually sometimes you might want someone who can be a data analyst but also turn the hand to some analytics engineering and perhaps to some level like data engineering. So like, and especially within small teams, you kind of want people who are able to at least somewhat interface across a few of those areas. So like making that into a clear job specification and like being clear with what the career progression framework for that is, probably, at least for me, going from like a data team of one person of just up to two is probably like a tricky thing to balance. And I don't think there's like one right answer, but yeah, I definitely think like having clarity over what you want is the harder part. That's harder to get right, and you need to get right.
And how did you come to the, sorry, how did you come to the choice of like data analyst being the role that you wanted to hire? Was that because it's like complementary to your own skill set, or was that to do with the work that was out there? Or yeah, how did you come to that choice?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture. I think it was both of those things, to be honest. I think it was complementary to my skill set, so I was very kind of happy to to align myself more on the architecture and engineering side and let go of like more of the analytics work I was doing, with the kind of acknowledgement that there will still perhaps always be some slight crossover at the boundaries. So yeah, that was part of the decision. And yeah, I think like the volume of work was the other side of it, kind of as you say, like the bulk of what needed doing at this point is actually translating the kind of data stack we've got at the moment into actual insights, and having someone living and breathing the data that we've got, understanding what's going on across our products, and understanding how well conversion is happening on X number of different forms across the site. And yeah, so I think it was skill mix driven and volume and type of work driven. Yeah.
When you decided on that role, we have a great question from our friend Jack Liu, who asked, what attributes and traits make a great analyst? What did you look out for in your recent hire?
So I always like, one of the big things for me with analysts is just, I think like a lot of the kind of skills are very interchangeable. I think I see a lot of job roles where they're looking specifically for someone who knows Looker or Metabase, whatever. And for me, that's quite secondary. I think like the primary thing I'm looking for is someone who's curious and someone who has kind of good intuition and like solving puzzles and is good at solving puzzles. I think like that is the harder bit to train. And I think people actually enjoy the work as well and have, willing to look for new solutions to problems. I think that's the much better thing to interview for. I think people potentially put too much stock in how hard it is to pick up Looker or Tableau. I think that's very much a harder thing to train than it is to train curiosity. I don't think, sure you can, but I think that's much more difficult from my point of view than it is to do a few half-day sessions on whatever BI tool you happen to be using. Yeah, there's other stuff apart from that, but I think that's like one of the main dimensions I definitely look for. And I think another thing, which is probably another big one as well, which is often overlooked, is kind of commercial acumen and understanding how what you do affects the business. So, a lot of questions I ask at interviews will be around specific examples of work people have done, but with a kind of a key focus on how did that improve whatever bit of the business you were working in. Less so on the, can you do Python and SQL, I think are still valid things, but I think they're the big ones for me.
How much did you value candidates who worked on smaller data teams, like smaller data teams and companies of current classic size? Did you think about that?
To some degree, I probably did, but like not massively, if I'm honest. No, I think I'd worked in much bigger companies early career and kind of made the transition to smaller ones, and I think I don't know if this is right, but it feels like that's perhaps the easier transition to make in some ways. My experience of going from a big company to a small company was, oh my gosh, there's so much less red tape. I can actually just kind of do things. I don't have to go through 5 levels of IT approval to get Notepad++ installed on my computer. Like, so, and I don't remember that being like a hard transition at all. I guess I'm never going to kind of, at some point later in my career, I might make the transition back to a bigger company, but I expect that would be a harder thing. So no, yeah, it was something I suppose was in the back of my head, but it wasn't in any way like criteria. I think I was sorting candidates for, us, viewing it on kind of like a individual basis, and I think it is a different thing, and I think people have to be more autonomous working in a small company for the most part. So I think, if I was interviewing someone I knew they were coming from quite a large team, I think my questions would probably focus a bit more in on, how do you do working autonomously within a team? Can you give me an example of a time you've had to steer a project yourself and that sort of stuff?
That makes a ton of sense. And at least my last question is, what's your biggest piece of advice for James 10 months ago? when starting this role?
That is a great question. Wow. Give me 2 seconds to think of an answer to that. It's tough because a lot of the lessons I kind of took into this role were from previous roles. So I was already had, to some extent, I already had that myself 10 months in the future telling me some of that. Probably to like maybe I probably could have. I was like maybe a little bit too focused on the data stack versus like actually building out analytics and like useful stuff in the first instance, which was good because I think it got us to where we needed to be. But actually, I think I probably could have got like more buy-in earlier on if I'd have just focused on like tech stack aside, like here's some insight on kind of our biggest business problems at the moment. So I probably would have like allocated myself a little bit more time just to do some interesting insight stuff with the data we had at the time, even if that kind of data stack around it wasn't perfect, because there was like a bit of a lead in time for me of like build, deliver, which in retrospect worked fine. But like I think delivering some stuff earlier on could have been delivering some insight earlier on could maybe have sped up the process of embedding that when I did get to the end of that process. If that makes sense.
Sounds like
it felt like a very bad answer.
It does. It sounds like a tricky trade-off to negotiate.
Yeah, that's it. Because like a lot of that is you don't want to build stuff on poor foundations, but I think sometimes you just kind of have to. Yeah, so it's that balance, isn't it? And it's I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think definitely thinking about kind of the tech that you're building up is always a thing. As you're trying to build fast, definitely think about what's building up in the background and like give a lot of focus to documentation, quality of code, robustness of things. Don't just build and forget and let things build up. And I suppose kind of data quality tech that is also a thing for us. So thinking about that early on as well.
Yeah, right. And to your point, building those quick wins on the weaker foundations is tech debt if you're going to be migrating anyways, right?
Yeah, that's it. It's such a balancing act of like delivery versus quality of what you're building versus how much you kind of it's going to drag you down in the future. So it's a tricky, definitely like tiny team is definitely a tricky balance of those things.
This has been super interesting. And yeah, personally, I'm going to take a lot of this with us because a lot of what you talked about, I think, is relevant for data teams, of course, but also for startups in general, right? That constant pressure of a win today for potentially pain tomorrow. That is really helpful.
Oh, I'm glad you think so.
Raul has one more question, and then maybe we'll wrap up our conversation. Thank you, Raul, for the question. He asks, can you talk about how you handle data science/machine learning projects with little or no team? Also, what skill set would you look for if you could hire data scientists and machine learning engineers to help those efforts?
Yeah, so I've got a bit of a background in data science myself, so able to pick up some of the basic stuff. Like I found 90% of the business value that we kind of deliver at the moment is outside of that and just building up the foundations for that. I think a lot of startups perhaps hire data science and ML too soon into their data journey. So to kind of answer the question broadly, we don't have a huge amount of data science/ML projects, so we don't necessarily handle them. We do have a few smaller ones that I kind of pick up as hobby projects. But yeah, I mean, again, skill set for that, for data science and ML engineers, like ML engineering definitely isn't my core skill set. Something I've had like a huge amount of experience with. So in that case, I'd always reach out to people who I've worked with who are in that space in my network, who I could then kind of leverage their experience to help me hire on that front. I think like acknowledging where you don't necessarily have the experience is super valuable. And the data community is fantastic. I'm sure we've all worked with like a lot of great people in different spaces to our own, so leveraging that's super important. And I think data scientists, for me, it strikes me as like, I think there's kind of like a lot of overlap in the skills that you'd look for in a data analyst that you would in a data scientist. It's all about curiosity, diligence, interest in how what they're doing relates to the wider business, etc., etc. And I think, there's grey areas between them as well. But I hope I've answered that well, and it was a bit of a rambling answer, but
no, you're right. Like those skills are hard to teach, but so fundamental to our work. And does anyone have any last questions from the audience? Or James, is there anything that you would like to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think that's been like, in terms of the questions you've asked, they've all been great. I think like fairly comprehensive for the subject of the talk. So yeah, unless there's any more questions.
Thanks so much for coming on, James. It's been really great.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so appreciate it. And this conversation was so interesting, at the least because every big team starts as a small team, and every small team starts with one. So thank you, James, for talking about all of your wisdom. And Dave and I will stand by that word. Although you may be, you're a modest man. We will heroic, wise, and
I'll put that as my LinkedIn header, James Sharwin, heroic and wise.
Heroic and wise, yeah.
We're going to endorse you for it right now. So.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the questions, everyone who asked questions as well. They were really good questions.
And looking forward to hanging out in San Diego for Coalesce 23. And talk to you soon, James. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.